Example, noun, 1. Example of something. Something such as an object, a fact, or a situation that shows, explains, or supports what you say. Can you give me an example of what you mean? This dictionary has many examples of how words are used. Just to give you an example of his generosity, he gave me his old car and wouldn't take any money for it. It is important to cite examples to support your argument. I shall take 4 different examples from contemporary literature to illustrate my point. 2. Example of something. A thing that is typical of or represents a particular group or set. This is a good example of the artist's early work. It is a perfect example of a medieval castle. Japan is often quoted as the prime example of a modern industrial nation. It is a classic example of how not to design a new city center. 3. A person or their behavior that is thought to be a good model for others to copy. Example to somebody. Her courage is an example to us all. He sets an example to the other students. Example of something. She is a shining example of what people with disabilities can achieve. He is a captain who leads by example. 4. A person's behavior, either good or bad, that other people copy. It would be a mistake to follow his example. Extra examples. An athlete, for example, might turn the pedals 80 times a minute. Children learn by example. Consider the following example. Fisher used a hypothetical example to illustrate his point. He uses a number of historical examples to support his thesis. His generosity is an example to us all. His treatment of his secretary was a blatant example of managerial arrogance. I think all schools should follow the example of this one. I was inspired by the example of the athlete who trained so hard. Let me give a concrete example of what I mean. She illustrates her point with examples drawn from contemporary newspaper accounts. She is a shining example of how to organize your time. The book is full of practical examples of classroom activities. The headmaster had made an example of him by scolding him in front of the whole school. The leaflet includes several examples of bad grammar. The oft-quoted example of Nero playing the violin as Rome burned shows the emperor's detachment from reality. The teacher in our example is clearly wrong. The teacher made an example of him by suspending him from school. These examples suggest that there is a connection between the two processes. This film is a poor example of the genre. This is a classic example of a badly designed building. This is among the worst examples of corporate greed. This is far from an isolated example. To take an obvious example, if there is a good harvest, the price of grain will fall. 27 examples are presented in this video. We can still find examples of discrimination today. We've seen other examples of this same problem recently. You must set a good example to the children. A book filled with real-life examples that anyone can relate to. A magnificent example of 18th century architecture. A telling example of how difficult it can be to succeed in business. The example shown in Figure 2. The most egregious example of his mishandling of the situation. He is a captain who leads by example. How many other exiles like him would his example encourage? It is a classic example of how not to design a new town. It would be a mistake to follow his example. Just to give you an example of his generosity, he gave me his old car and wouldn't take any money for it. They started to plan protests, inspired by the example of their neighbors. This is a good example of the artist's early work. You are setting a bad example to the children.